Seems to me we left off on page 55. The second full paragraph, I got a little mark on that page.
Yeah.
Everybody got it too? Everybody knows, double check me now. Who knows where we're gonna end up, you know? All right, so we're in this chapter 4, we agnostics. This chapter is all about step 2. We got the directions for step 2 in it. And they kind of summarized those directions again. We did read what the directions were early on in the chapter, but back on page 53, just back up a couple of pages from where we left off. And the second full paragraph, it says, when we became alcoholics, crushed by a self-imposed crisis, we could not postpone or evade. We had to fearlessly face the proposition that either God is everything or he's nothing. God either is or he isn't. What's your choice to be? That's the question within step 2. But the beginning of that, I kind of want to focus on the beginning of that paragraph. It says, when we became alcoholics, now, how did we become alcoholics? It says that we were crushed by a self-imposed crisis. Who created our crisis? Here it's talking about self. So when we come through these doors for our first time, we got all these problems. They're indicating right now something that we're going to start seeing more and more after this chapter. Who created the problems? It wasn't alcohol. It wasn't alcohol. They're saying it as a self-imposed crisis. So what do they mean by a self-imposed crisis? Well, we learned a little bit about this in the previous chapters with step 1, the second part of it, talking about our lives becoming unmanageable. Self-imposed crisis with our lives becoming unmanageable. What does that mean? What does that look like? Question is, do you have a self-imposed crisis? Is your life unmanageable? And they gave us back, if you remember on page 52, one page before, they tell us what this self-imposed crisis, this unmanageable life looks like. I just want to run through this again. They give us 6, 7 different examples for you to determine if your life is unmanageable based on what they're saying. And the first thing that they say here in the second full paragraph in 52 says one of these symptoms of this unmanageable life is that we're having trouble with our personal relationships. Any of us having troubles with our personal relationships? I mean, I can tell you that my trouble with my personal relationships is 90% of what brought me through that door. It was not that I thought I drank too much alcohol. And by the second thing, which is we couldn't control our emotional natures. That has a lot to do with why I had so many problems with my personal relationships, because I had a problem controlling my personal emotions. Emotional nature. We're prey to misery and depression and on and on. You can read all of that. That is what's forcing us, if you will, to make this determination that either God is or he isn't. And for some, that might not be a hard sound that you're just, open to God, whatever. And that might be easy for you. But if you remember in the beginning of the chapter, it said that more than half of the original membership was either atheist or agnostic. And a lot of them, including Bill, when we read in Bill's story, had a hard time choking down this idea of God. Didn't want anything to do with it. Debbie told him that he recovered and got well, and he said, well, what did you do? He said, I found religion. And Bill's mind snapped shut. Want nothing to do with that. But the reason he continued to explore it was one thing. One thing. His life, to put it mildly, had become quite unmanageable. Quite unmanageable. He couldn't get it together. And he knew he was going to die. It says earlier in this chapter that that's where alcohol becomes the great persuader. It beats us into a state of reasonableness. Or it doesn't, and we die that way. He was beaten to a state of reasonableness. This is the question. This is kind of where we're at, finishing up step 2 that I want you guys to think about before we get into step 3. Is this idea of he either is or he isn't. That's a decision we have to make. You don't have to do anything with it, but just are you open-minded? And if you have a hard time with it, then it comes down to, well, have you been beaten to a state of reasonableness? Or do you think you could still get out there and control? I'm not talking about controlling your drinking now. I think you can go out there and control your life. think you can manage your life? Because I can tell you, it seems to me that most everybody who walks through those doors for the first time, that is the problem. They're having problems with their life. Their life is out of control. My life was under control, and I was living just fine, even if I couldn't stop drinking or control the amount I took. But my life was good. I'd have never walked through those doors. Thank you very much. That wasn't the problem. The problem is the way I was living and the way I felt. And how did the doctor put it? My problems had piled up on me and become astonishingly difficult to solve. And they're saying that the solution, next paragraph in 52 says, we saw others solve their problems. And notice they use problems with an S. So we're not talking about the alcohol problem. They solve their problems by a simple reliance upon the spirit of the universe. Therefore, we had to stop doubting the power of God because our ideas didn't work, but the God idea did. It's a great question for yourself. Do I still think that my ideas are off to you? That's what it tells us. Go out there and try to manage your life. And if you can do it, that's a wonderful thing. You won't have to show up here on Saturday morning or any other time, right? But if you can't, then the only thing that AA has to offer is one thing: dependence upon a power greater than yourself, your own conception of God. It is not a dependence on AA meetings. It is not a dependence on a sponsor. It's not a dependence on your group. It is dependence upon God. That's why we're talking about it right after step one. We have to have an idea. It's to start the dependence deal, to start it. It's the beginning of depending on God. It has to start with, are you even open to the idea that there is a God? And that's all step two is. That makes sense, I hope?
Yes, sir.
So now getting back to page 55, second full paragraph. While we do get our own conception of God, and the funny thing is I've learned over the years, over many years of coming around AA, without having studied this book, pretty much most of everything that I knew about this book was written up here. And in the how it works that they usually read at the beginning of the meetings, and then the promises. So all that gave me all of my education, that pretty much 90% of my education in AA. So what I found myself talking about, and a lot of people talking about when they were talking about step two, is the whole idea here was to get your own conception of God, right? My power greater than myself. That's my power, my higher power. That's what we're talking about. And we think that that's all it has to do with is and people have taken that to such extremes, and I think I've mentioned this before, like I've heard so many times it said at meetings in the past that, this coffee cup is my higher power, or that doorknob, that's my higher power, right? Because I can have my own conception. Don't question it. But that's not the case. As we get into reading in this chapter, there's more, there are actually some qualifications for what this higher power is supposed to look like. We're not telling you what to believe, but there's going to be a little bit of framework around it. Okay, that's the work. And the first part of it is, lo and behold, on this thing up here. And it says that power, it's got to have the power that it can restore me to sanity. Now, again, going to AA and never studying this, I had no idea what they even meant by sanity. But now that we studied this, we understand what that means, that mental condition, right? That coffee cup does not have the power to restore my sanity. Neither does the doorknob. Neither does the combination of both of them. That power is not there. It says, and we've already read before, that it has to make sense to us. And I would ask, if that is your higher power, does that make sense to you? That has the power to restore your sanity? Exactly how would that work? Have you seen that happen with somebody else? Did you talk to John? John said, this is the doorknob you need, man. I've never seen that. That's a qualification. What we're going to get into in the second paragraph here, we're going to get into a much deeper qualification. So let's pay attention to what they say here. It says, actually, we were fooling ourselves. For deep down inside of every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. Where's God? Well, it's here where the qualification where we're going to find him. It's deep down inside of every man, woman, and child. It says that's where we're going to find God. And then I would have to ask, I'd have to ask you, that coffee cup or that doorknob, is that deep down inside of you? Or is it sitting here right in front of you? That's a qualification. It may be obscured by calamity, by pomp, sounds like ego, by worship of other things, but in some form or another, it is there. For faith in a power greater than ourselves and miraculous demonstrations of that power in human lives are fact as old as man himself. We finally saw that faith in some kind of God was a part of our makeup inside of us, just as much as the feeling we have for a friend. Sometimes we had to search fearlessly, but he was there. I think we read this earlier. Who does the searching? Looks like here we're going to be the ones that have to do the searching. And if we do search, we're going to find that he is there. He was as much a fact as we were. We found the great reality that is a capital G and a capital R, that is code word for God. We found the great reality deep down within us. And in the last analysis, it is only there that he may be found. And it was so with us. Well, that's where God is. Very deep qualification, do you think? We had that information to keep a lot of us more on track, I think. We can only clear the ground a bit, and if our testimony, that's what we got here, by the way, is their testimony. Remember they said in the beginning, this is an account of their experiences, right? Factual accounts. If our testimony, one, sweeps away your prejudice, which we covered a lot in this chapter, if it enables you to think honestly and encourages you to search diligently within yourself, it's the three things. It's three things this whole chapter is about. It ain't to convince you of any kind of God. It simply encourages you to sweep away your prejudice, to think honestly, and to search diligently within yourself. If you do that, it says, then if you wish, you can join us on the broad highway. That's all you need. With this attitude, you cannot fail. That might be a good one to underline. What's your odds of being successful if you have that attitude? It says you cannot. It doesn't even say rarely are you going to fail. It says you cannot fail. You cannot. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you. In this book, you will read the experience of a man who thought he was an atheist. His story is so interesting that some of it should be told now. His change of heart was dramatic, convincing, and moving. Our friend was a minister's son. He attended church school, where he became rebellious at what he thought an overdose of religious education. For years thereafter, he was dogged by trouble and frustration, business failure, insanity, fatal illness, suicide. These calamities in his immediate family embittered and depressed him. Post-war disillusionment, ever more serious alcoholism, impending mental and physical collapse brought him to the point of self-destruction. One night, when confined in a hospital, he was approached by an alcoholic who had known a spiritual experience. Who approached who? Sounds like the guy who had had a spiritual experience. That's a guy who's recovered. Approached the sick guy in the hospital. Our friend's gorge rose as he bitterly cried out, "If there's a God, he certainly hasn't done anything for me." Sounds like an agnostic. Might be a God. He's not saying there isn't one. If there is one, he hasn't done anything for me. But later, alone in his room, he asked himself this question: is it possible that all the religious people I've known are wrong? That's using reason. Is that possible? Billions of people are wrong and I'm right. While pondering the answer, he felt as though he lived in hell. And then, like a thunderbolt, a great thought came and it crowded out all else. Who are you to say there is no God? This man recounts he tumbled out of bed to his knees. In a few seconds, he was overwhelmed by a conviction of the presence of God. It poured over and through him with the certainty and majesty of a great tide at flood. The barriers he had built through the years were swept away. He stood in the presence of infinite power and love. He'd stepped from bridge to shore, and for the first time, he lived in conscious companionship with his Creator. This was our friend's cornerstone fixed in place, and no later vicissitude shook it. His alcoholic problem was taken away. I would underline that. His alcoholic problem was taken away. And mentioned before, it didn't happen around step 9. It happened right here in step 2. His alcoholic problem had been taken away. That very night years ago, it disappeared. Save for a few brief moments of temptation, the thought of drink had never returned. And at such times, a great revulsion had risen up in him. Seemingly, he couldn't drink even if he wanted to. God had restored his sanity, underline and highlight that. That is the completion of step. God actually restored it. It doesn't say that that necessarily happens in step 2. It happens when we have a spiritual experience, which in step 12 says, it doesn't say you have a spiritual experience in step 12, because if it did, it would mean that you would get it at step 12 here says, having had it, you already had it by the time you got here. We also know they give us another guidepost around step 9. They say, you should have had it by now. If not, you missed something. So we know it happened somewhere between 1 and 9. Definitely by 9, you will have had it. This guy had it right here in step 2, because what happens when we recover? What happens when we have a spiritual experience? When we have a spiritual experience, we recover our sanity. That is to become recovered, because you recover your sanity. God had restored his sanity. He came to believe there's a power that could, and right at that same point, it happened for this guy. Right? Sanity was restored, recovered. What is this but a miracle of healing? Yes, its elements are simple. Circumstances made him willing to believe. You saw in the beginning, he didn't want to believe, just like Bill. Circumstances made him willing to believe. Alcohol, the great persuader. He humbly offered himself to his maker, and then he knew. Even so has, and I would underline this, God restored us all to our right minds. All the authors of this book had their sanity restored. They just said it right there. Every one of them. To this man, the revelation was sudden, just like with Bill. Some of us grow into it more slowly. Most of us grow into it more slowly. But he has come to all who have honestly sought him. When we draw near to him, he discloses himself to us. That's the deal. We draw near, we do the seeking, and he will disclose himself to us. That makes sense? That ends chapter 4. And we'll open the floor for a few minutes for any questions about this. We covered a lot in the last, I think this is our 4th week doing step 2. There's a lot of information there.